Good evening, everybody. Welcome along. I will just um, leave a couple of minutes for everyone to join. Really nice to have you all here this evening. So nice to see lots of you coming in. Thank you for spending, well, so I am at the other end of the country than I expect you guys will be. So I'm down on the south coast and we have had such a glorious day. Um, it feels like summer is just hanging on, which is amazing. So we have a lovely evening, albeit a bit warm. Hopefully, you have also had some bright weather where you are. Okay, brilliant to see all of you here. Um, whilst we're in this session, I'm going to do the introductions in a minute and do the formal getting started bit. But whilst we're here, if you would like to ask a question during the session, please use the put your hand up option if you have it. Otherwise, leave a note in the chat. I won't be able to see the chat as we go through, but I will check it at the end so I can address any questions at the end. So if I'm talking and you're thinking, oh, I'd really like to ask this, please use the chat to pop in any questions you have, and I will hopefully get to those at the end. So welcome, everyone. I think we've had the initial flurry of everyone joining, so I will get started because we've got a bit to get through this evening. My name is Emma, and actually I'm going to change. Can I change my name on here? Let me just do it so you let's put my name there. We go. My name is Emma, Dr. Emma Ross, and I am part of an organisation called the Well HQ, which is why that name was appearing on my Zoom. And it's my pleasure to be here with Scottish Hockey this evening. So to give you a little bit of background about me and about why I'm here talking to you about the female athlete, about women in sport, I was the head of physiology at the UK Sports Institute, formerly the English Institute of Sport, for 2 Olympic cycles. So I joined in that role after London 2012. And I was there through the Rio cycle and the slightly longer than we expected Tokyo cycle. And in my time there, I was in charge of the physiology team who were working with all sorts of Olympic and Paralympic sports, as you can imagine, hockey being one of them, based down at Bisham, if any of you know it. And that used to be my headquarters. So I was very familiar with all of the hockey crew there. But also in sports like sailing and cycling and rowing and athletics, and that was one of the joys of my job, was to have to understand lots of different sports. And then after the 2016 Rio Games, we were doing the usual debrief of what had gone well in that Olympic cycle and what hadn't, and what we might focus on as a system in the coming cycle for Tokyo. And one of the things that was important to us as physiologists was that it was going to be really hot and humid in Tokyo, and all the physiologists went crazy because it was their time to shine in terms of preparing athletes to perform really well in the heat and humidity. But also, one of the things that I suggested that we start getting curious about and asking questions about was whether we supported our female athletes as well as we could. Because I'd been a physiologist, so really trying to understand the human body and how to optimize it for performance. I'd been a physiologist in that system for nearly 4 or 5 years at that time, and no one had ever spoken about or even asked questions about whether female physiology was important to consider differently than male physiology. And actually, as I started to explore it a bit more, it appeared to me that we were supporting our athletes with probably what was intentionally an equality lens, as in there is no difference. These people in front of me are brilliant athletes. I want to prepare them as such, and I will treat them as such, and I won't necessarily worry whether they're a male or a female. But that has some inherent problems, as we'll get into in today's session. Mainly because men and women and males and females are different, and to allow everyone to realize their full potential in sport, whether that's at a participation level or at an elite level, we might have to do different things to support them. And that's totally okay. That's actually really brilliant ways of coaching and supporting athletes, is to say, what do you need as an individual? And how can I give it to you? And so I was asking this with the kind of biological sex, like women versus men lens on, saying, do we need to do anything differently for the female athletes? And the answer was yes. And I kind of had two different views in front of me. I had the coaches and the athletes who were like, well, no, we don't do that at the moment, so why would we need to? And then I had the science and the researchers who were saying, actually, some of this stuff is really important and can have a performance benefit, it can have an athlete health benefit, it can have an enjoyment and perception benefit. And so actually what we did for the next 4 years was really explore how we could support female athletes really well. And then after Tokyo, I wanted to broaden the reach of that work, and I wanted to reach down the performance pathway from elite sport, but also to people in grassroots sport. And so along with 2 other women's health specialists, I started the Well HQ, and that's what we do today. We work with lots of national governing bodies and brands as well to help educate, raise awareness, inform, and really further our understanding of why we need to acknowledge and support females in a female-centric way, whether we want them to just enjoy sport or whether we want them to perform at the highest level. So that's a bit of background about me, and kind of leads into where we're going with today's session. So I'm just going to share my screen with you to share some slides. And today's session is going to be on the female mindset, but we've got a number of sessions that follow this across the coming months, and we're going to get into lots of different aspects of what it is to be a woman in sport, a female athlete, and what it is to coach and support female athletes. We're starting with mindset, but we're going to cover a breadth of topics that I'll just touch on at the beginning of this session, just to give you kind of like a flavour of that. And as I say, please do leave questions in the chat or put your hand up. And I can try and take you off mute if I can do all the tech at the same time, because this really is your opportunity to kind of get curious about it and ask questions if you need to. We take for granted that, well, do we take for granted, or do we assume that some of this stuff we'll inherently know if we're working in women's sport? Particularly if we're a woman, we are born into a woman's body, surely we know how it all works. But actually, what we see time and time again is that girls and women are, I will use a term from a report that was written in 2019 by the government, and they said women are woefully uneducated about their bodies at every life stage. And they were looking at how women understand lots of different things about being a female and things that happen to our bodies, like periods, like puberty, like menopause, like pregnancy, etc. So woefully uneducated about our bodies. That's the females. So you can imagine that the guys are equally kind of uninformed about some of this stuff. And I'm working with another national governing body, and we had a really great chat the other week about, they were working with a group of coaches who were working with the female athletes and were very, very dedicated and invested in women's sport and really passionate about it. Yet they reflected now in 2024 that all through their coach education in women's sport, they hadn't been exposed to some of the topics that we were then covering. And that's kind of what we want to shift. And that's why we're so thrilled that governing bodies like yours have said, yeah, let's try and raise the awareness of this. Let's try and open up the conversation about different parts of being female that might be really important to engaging women in sport, helping them perform, and even helping them perform to the highest level. And I really like to think of it like a system, like the system of hockey, let's say. And you've got everyone who's trying to support the player, and that might be their family. If they're a younger player, it might be their mum and their dad, it might be their coach, it might be their school system, it might be all the different parts of their life that's allowing them to go to hockey and play and be a healthy individual and be fit and eat the right things and all of that. We can look at that system, but we have to ensure that that system is helping elevate that person in the direction of their goals. And there's a brilliant book by a guy called James Clear, and it's called Atomic Habits. Now, it's not about sport or about women in sport. It's about developing healthy habits, and it's brilliant. I would highly recommend it. But he says we do not rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. And what we love the fact that when we engage with NGBs like Scottish Hockey, that they're trying to do is just piece together bits of the system that we've left out. So you've probably got a brilliant system. You've got great coaches who know loads about hockey. They care about their players. They care about their sport. They care about the growth of the sport. They care about people enjoying the sport, and all of those parts of the system are in place. But there are bits of the system that we know, because we have far too many stories of athletes who have been part of that system, not necessarily hockey, just sport in general, where they haven't risen to the level of their goals because they haven't been supported by a system that has acknowledged, understood, and supported the fact that they were female. And that system, as well as including all the things that we already know about sports performance, about hockey, about coaching young adult athletes, whatever it is, needs to also have these things woven through it if we're going to really support women and girls well in sport. So we need to acknowledge that girls have a different physiology to boys, and that one of the defining differences is the fact we have the menstrual cycle, and that changes our hormones, that changes our physiology, which in turn changes everything about us. You know, hormones can affect us physically, emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally, and we don't necessarily take that into account when we're thinking about people turning up and performing at their best. We need to think about nutrition. We're actually going to touch on this today when we talk about mindset. We need to think about how girls and women think about food versus how boys do, our attitudes and beliefs about eating and food and body confidence and body image, rather than just thinking, well, I know what a hockey player needs to eat before and after their match to perform really well. Girls develop breasts during puberty, and therefore they need to manage those with breast support, a sports bra. Yet we don't get taught anything about that when we are growing up and our body is developing. Women have much more pelvic floor dysfunction than men all through our lives, not just when we're postnatal or menopausal, even when we're young, physically fit young women. But we don't talk about that at all, mainly because it's embarrassing and it's taboo. Women are up to 6 times more likely to suffer an ACL injury than men after puberty. You might have heard that mentioned in the sort of realms of your sport, in games play, where ACL injuries are more common. But we haven't necessarily really understood or researched or come up with any interventions to specifically help that until very recently. Kit isn't necessarily made for women's bodies, often, particularly in sports where men were there first, football, rugby, cricket. The kit has been designed and made for men and then just kind of shrunk down and expected to work for women. And kit is highly technical and often hasn't been optimized for women's bodies, and so on and so on. And so one of the things we want to do by this series of webinars that are going to run over the next few months is to talk about some of these factors and topics and bring them to life in terms of how you as a coach or as a hockey player could understand them and integrate them into, you know, how you go about engaging with hockey, performance, enjoyment of sport. Because when we get these things right, we create an environment where females feel like they can thrive, they feel like they belong, because sport has for so long been a place where women have kind of arrived later. In some sports, you know, like in football, where women were banned for 50 years, women have arrived very late, and they've kind of fitted into a system that's been optimized for men. And that was the most sensible thing to do, because men were the only people there, or men were the only people allowed to play competitive sport. And that's true for most sports. And so the system was designed with men in mind, quite rightly so, because they were the main people playing. But then women have come along, and you know, and their membership and commitment and participation has been embraced, but they've had to fit into a system that was already pre-designed for men. And what we need to do now is kind of say, actually, that really works for these people, but how about we design an approach and a system and a way of thinking about women in sport that really fits their needs as well. And that's what this series of webinars is going to kind of embrace. Because we've got examples of so many athletes, and you might think when I tell a few of these stories that, oh gosh, these are the exceptions, and surely that's not happening. But I can guarantee that any of the stories that I tell tonight are replicated kind of week in, week out with all of the people and the organizations we work with, they are not exceptional. So these athletes, all of these athletes you can see in front of you, and many, many more, have fallen to the level of a system that hasn't acknowledged and supported the fact that they're female. One example is Bobby Clay there. You can see her with the GB flag. And Bobby Clay was an aspiring young endurance athlete. She had high hopes of becoming a fully funded, Olympic athlete. And she was in her teenage years. And as with many sports, there was a pressure to stay very light because light athletes run faster, essentially. That's the math. It's not an infinite sort of equation though, because you can't be lighter and lighter and lighter and run faster and faster and faster. You'll be light and run fast, and then eventually you'll be so light that you'll break and you'll be ill and you won't be able to run at all. But as a young athlete, dealing with the idea that you have to be a certain size or shape, training a lot because that's what sport requires, puts you at great risk of underfueling, of creating this imbalance of energy where you're not eating enough to fuel the demands of your training, of your growth and development through your teenage years and your busy life. And that's what happened to Bobby Clay, but she didn't know it was happening. So the first kind of sign that sort of exposed itself was that she didn't start her periods when she was 15, 14, 15, 16. And she said to those around her, I haven't started my periods. Is this normal? And because in sport at the time, this was about a decade ago, it was considered completely normal for girls not to have periods if they were light and lean and trained very hard. Everyone said, yeah, that's completely normal. So she just carried on training really hard and eating not enough food for her growth, for her development, for her progress, for her adaptation to training and to fuel the training that she was doing. And then one day she was swimming in the pool. She was doing a recovery swim. She pushed off the wall and she broke her leg. Now, you're not meant to break your leg in a swimming pool, of all places. It's non-weight bearing, it's buoyant, low intensity exercise. But what had happened in Bobby Clay's body is that because she hadn't been fueling well enough, the human body is hardwired for survival. It will do everything it can to preserve its survival. And when it's consistently getting not enough energy, it has to make a decision. It has to start to shut things down to save energy. But in the human body, it can't shut down the brain, even though that does use a lot of energy, because otherwise we'd die. Can't shut off the muscular system, that uses loads of energy, but we'd fall over and die. So the thing that a female body can shut off and save loads of energy, but actually not really have any mega consequences outwardly, is its reproductive system. And so that's what was happening in Bobby's body. She wasn't fueling well enough. Her body was trying to save energy. So it thought, well, I won't have a menstrual cycle. That means I don't have to produce hormones. I don't have to have periods. And I certainly don't have to risk getting pregnant and growing a baby, which would be catastrophic energy wise. And that's why she didn't start her periods. But that is a massive sign of dysfunction because the hormones of the menstrual cycle aren't just important for creating a reproductive cycle. They're really important for our brain health, our cognition, our bone health, our heart health, our immune function, our gut health, our cardiovascular function. Everything kind of is influenced by these really important hormones, and particularly bone health. And so as Bobby was growing up and developing in her teenage years, she didn't have the vital hormones that would allow her to lay down her bone strength. And so on that day she broke her leg, it was because she had developed osteopenia. She had developed essentially hollow bones because she hadn't had the hormones helping her grow and develop strong bones. And she developed osteoporosis in her early 20s. That is a system that hasn't supported an athlete and said, oh, we know about female physiology. We know you should be having periods. And if you're not, let's do something about it. We know you're at risk of underfueling as a female athlete. Let's have a look at that. It just said, nah, you're fine, and let her carry on and essentially break. And there are loads of other examples. I will get to them in some of the future webinars, so I'm not going to go into all of them today. But needless to say, we don't want this happening in our sport. We want girls and women to obviously enjoy their sport, be able to perform at the highest level, and not worry that them being female is being overlooked and it's going to be at their detriment. Because when we do acknowledge all of those things that I had in that slide, which had all of those factors, periods and menstrual cycles and bras and pelvic floors and injury, when we do pay attention to that, understand it, and when appropriate, kind of weave it into how we support girls and women, we create an environment where the girls feel like they belong. One of my most favorite moments of all the projects I've done in women's sport was when we did a sports bra project ahead of the Tokyo Games. And I'll probably get to the science of breast support and breast movement in another webinar. But essentially, sports bras are really important, and they can affect performance as well as just how we feel. And we did a fitting at lots of different high performance sites, and one of them was Bisham, and we got all the hockey girls, and they came in and they had their bra fits. And I was standing outside. They were obviously in the fitting room getting measured and getting fitted with a sports bra. And at one point I heard these shrieks, and I was like, what is going on in there? You're like, just putting on a bra. And it was because, and the player came out and said, well, first of all, I never thought I could find a well-fitting bra like this that didn't feel like I was, being suffocated or like being like in a corset. I've just been shown something for the first time in my life that's going to be really helpful, and it's now comfortable, and I didn't know about it, and I was an athlete. Oh my gosh, how did I not know about that? And she said, and that means more than just the effect of having a bra that helps my performance and how I feel. It makes me feel like this system has acknowledged that I'm female and says, you're welcome here, you belong here, and we're going to do everything we can to kind of acknowledge that. So her sense of belonging was enhanced by paying attention to that. We know that we can keep girls much more healthy, physically and emotionally and mentally healthy, by paying attention to some of these things. We know that they have a knock-on effect to performance. When I worked in my previous job, my whole role was tied to medal outcomes, as is the whole UK high performance system ultimately. So I had to be able to demonstrate that anything that I was pushing as a project, as an agenda, as an extra education for the coaches, linked to performance, even though some of it I was like, it's just the right thing to do to support these girls in a way that's true to them. But actually I had to prove that it had a knock-on effect to performance. So that was really useful, because actually that is important to coaches and athletes. And for me, if we ignore some of this stuff, like the example I used to Bobby Clay, we are not living up to our duty of care to the girls. If we are not doing things that can help them and keep them safe and healthy while they're with us, so that when they leave, they're in a worse state, either physically, mentally, emotionally, then we haven't lived up to our duty of care. And that for me is really, really important as well. So hopefully over the course of the webinars that we're going to hold over the next few months, we can help you feel like you're really improving how girls feel like they belong, stay healthy, perform really well, and that you look after them within your sport, which is really exciting. So the first topic, as I said, we're going to cover is mindset, which is actually a really nice one for me to start on, because usually people go straight to periods and menstrual cycles and we get into the biology of that. But this is a really nice one to start on, because actually it's really, really important. And all the research we have about how girls engage with, stay with, and perform in sport, so like even just whether they stay and want to carry on playing sport, and then how well they perform, there is so much we know about things that are specific to girls and women that will improve that. And the caveat is that we're all unique, all of our brains are unique, and what I'm going to share with you tonight is going to be, on average, the findings that we have from groups of women. You may have a female who much more fits into a traditional male mindset, and vice versa. But as a whole, I hope that some of the things I'm going to share with you tonight will help you understand. It's not like a men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Like, I'm going to help you understand how women think. But it's just going to hopefully get you curious about what's showing up in front of you. One of my real passions is not to ever give anyone the prescription, because you guys are like the best at what you do. You know the athletes in front of you. If you're a hockey player yourself, you know your body, and all I want to do is give you information that helps you understand that better, that helps you ask questions of it, that helps you go, oh, that might be that, or that's definitely not that. What she said, no, that's not happening here, and just give you more information that might be helpful. But never to say, well, this is how you should coach women, this is how you should coach men, or this is how you should feel as a female athlete, because you are the expert in you. So as I say, all brains are beautifully unique, and there is, unlike some other parts of our body where if you unfortunately came across a deceased body and you wanted to identify whether they had been male or female, you would be able to take something like a bone length, or another, maybe even their skull size, for example, as a way of telling whether they were likely to be male or female. We can't do that with a brain. If you were to weirdly scoop out the brain of someone and plop it down on a bench and examine it, you could not tell whether that person had been male or female, because our brains are beautifully unique, and they aren't characterized by our sex. That being said, we all know that how we walk through this world, we are influenced by being a male or a female. Just the expectations that society puts on us shape how we think and behave. But also our genetics, also our hormones. I've mentioned the menstrual cycle before. Having sex hormones, so in men, testosterone, and in women, estrogen and progesterone, affects how we think, our psychology, our mood, our emotion, our behavior. So actually it does shape kind of our brain in a way that's specific to our sex. So there's a nature and a nurture to all of this, but we do know that all of those things together, how we were educated, the culture we come from, our families' attitudes and beliefs, societal attitudes and beliefs about our gender, our genetics, our hormones, our biology, all shape how we show up and how we think and behave. And that can be really, really important to understand when we're trying to get the best out of someone. So I'm going to pick up on a few things that we know might be different when we're dealing with groups of female athletes and groups of male athletes. And it's not that I say different, because I think a lot of the default kind of coaching approaches have been for the male athlete, what works for them. But actually, men are different from women, women are different from men. No one is better or worse than the other. These are just different ways of thinking and behaving in the context of sport that we notice about men and women. So the first is being emotional, and it's a master stereotype that women are more emotional than men. So master stereotype means if you go and ask anyone, a child, a man, a woman, an old person, a young person, and said who's more emotional, men or women, everyone would say women are more emotional than men. And that is where we're off to a bad start, because women aren't more emotional than men. We are all emotional. We are humans. So by having a brain, and by having quite a complex brain, we are all very emotional, and we respond emotionally to anything and everything. And so we're all emotional. How we process emotion can be different. So as a whole, women tend to process their emotions outwardly. So they might want to talk about it. They might want to vent about it. They might be angry about whatever they're feeling. They might want to cry. And that is a way of processing their emotion. It's not that they want someone else to fix it. It's not that they might be ranting and telling you so that you have a solution. It's just a really healthy way of processing it, and actually allowing space for that allows people to process that emotion, move past it, and get on with whatever's at hand. On the other hand, men have been known to much more commonly push their emotions down inside. We know that that's not a healthy way to manage and process emotions, and I think probably a movement now is to try and allow men to show more emotions, which would be really healthy. But they tend to squash them down inside, so they don't show them. And that's probably wrapped up in, boys don't cry, get on with it. But that, as we see sport unfolding, that can look very different. So it can look like the female athletes are crying more and getting more upset. And one coach of a football team actually came out last year, foolishly, and said, the reason my team lost was because they're too emotional. They're more emotional than men, and like that just went against them. But he specifically said they're more emotional than I'm used to coaching with men, and that lost them the game. Now, being emotional and not being able to process that emotion, and not having strategies to put behind you whatever's happened in a game, absolutely will be a detriment to performance. And coaching people to be able to do that is really important. But just by nature of being a woman didn't mean that they were more emotional and therefore lost the game. And I think it's really interesting that we ask people to be so invested in sport. The reason I love this picture is because everyone's showing huge emotion on this picture. We ask people to be so invested that they respond like this when things go well, but we don't want them to respond in the opposite way when things go badly. Yet we are asking them to be emotionally invested in this pursuit. And it's completely normal to have an emotional response when things don't go well. And if that's crying, that's crying. That's fine. That's not a sign of weakness. And I think in sport as a whole, we could do a lot better with being more comfortable sitting with people's emotions. So if you're a coach of an athlete and they're crying, maybe that's okay. Maybe you should say, like, yeah, like, let it all out. Like, it's okay to feel this emotion. That went really badly, and we're going to learn from it. But it's okay to be upset about it. And then actually that person can process that emotion and then move on, rather than saying, suck it up, let's get on with it. Because actually that's not a healthy way of processing emotions, and it's not how women tend to do it. And we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between coach and player in a minute and how important it is. And asking someone to push down emotion that they want to process in front of you and actually they feel safe processing in front of you can actually be a detriment to your relationship with them. So my advice is let people be emotional, let girls be emotional without judging them for it, and maybe build into your practices and your sessions time for them to do that. So you might be a coach who notices when the girls get together at the beginning of the session, a chat. That's brilliant. Let them, like, build in time to let them do that, because actually doing that and venting and getting off their chest everything they need to get off will allow them to be more present and show up having processed that emotion in your training session. So rather than saying, stop gossiping like a load of old fishwives, maybe build that in and say, this is your time to chat, to vent, to cry, to cuddle, whatever it is, because in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I'm going to want you here and present. So that's the first one. The second feature of the female brain that we didn't understand for a really long time is the idea of how girls and women cope with and work through stress. So all of you, I'm sure, would have heard of the fight or flight response. And it is a really well-established response to stress and threat. So whether it's an immediate threat, like, a car backfiring, or whether it's kind of constant stress, a lot of the research has been done into how our bodies respond. We've all heard of cortisol, stress hormones that rise. We've heard of the fight or flight response making us ready to run or fight. So our heart beats faster, our pupils dilate, blood starts going to our muscles so that we can use them if we need to. And that's a physiological response. In the year 2000, a female psychology researcher observed that that's not always how everyone copes with threat and stress. And in particular, she didn't see it happening as much in females. And so she did a series of research projects understanding stress and threat in females versus males. And she found that there was a whole nother system which allowed people to process and respond to stress and threat. And that was what she called tend and befriend. So instead of flight or fight, which kind of makes you feel like, oh gosh, like it's all action, all goes, tend and befriend was the release of hormones and chemicals in someone's body, which actually made them want to lean into social connections, build social networks, use other people to manage and process stress. if any of this is ringing a bell for you as a female or someone who works with females, then this might resonate, because it turned out that women much more use this, have this physiological response, and therefore use this approach to managing stress, i.e. using each other, using their social connections, using their friends, using their family, using that network to feel protected, to feel safe in times of stress and threat. Whereas men tended to show the other fight or flight response. Now, it's not unique to the sexes, and there will be some males who actually really benefit from the tend and befriend response, and vice versa. Actually, the theory is that everyone would benefit from the tend and befriend response if they could, because again, it's a really healthy way to manage stress or threat, healthier for our body, healthier for our brain. But it also leans into the fact that your girls are really, as a team especially, so connected to each other. And how can you use that? How can you use that environment as a coach or a player to say, if one of us is feeling stressed, or if all of us are, trying to figure something out, going through a stressful patch, how can we use each other? How can we capitalize on the fact that we have this ready-made social network that our biology is actually really hardwired for? What can we do? Not just on the pitch when we're training and everything's like all go, but how can we use that either before and after that session, or outside of that session, but come together as a group, either physically or digitally, to share our stresses and our worries and our the things that are going on in our lives, and use each other to help process that. And that's really powerful, because in a team sport, you have a ready-made social network, and that's part of the amazingness of it. But actually, to know that it can be a tool to help people get through things, and encouraging girls to lean into that is really valuable. Another thing that we see more in females than we do in males is the idea of being empathetic. So there was a huge study done by the University of Cambridge, which looked at how our brains work. And they found that women much more likely to be empathetic, and men much more likely to have a brain that was systemizing and kind of process logic driven. Again, not all men and women, but on the whole, in 14,000 people, the average results were. Now, that empathy is a real superpower. And again, it kind of goes back to the previous factor of kind of leaning into social networks. Girls and women are really good at understanding others, understanding what others are feeling, and being able to respond appropriately. And that is a really amazing skill, gift, if you like. Actually, when the powers that be that like to look at data and economics looked at COVID, even though something like only 17% of the countries were led by females during COVID, the female-led countries by far were the most successful in terms of their economy, in terms of how they controlled the virus, in terms of the sort of response from their communities and their populations. They were the best. And the researchers who did that work looked at how women led, and how women connected with other people and understood their point of view. So again, like as a coach, how can we use that? There will be loads of ways, and it won't just be having someone who's leading a group and saying, well, that's great, she's going to be a great leader. It might be creating buddy systems. We talk a lot about when girls are going through puberty, and all of the changes that they go through can feel really vulnerable physically and emotionally, huge changes going on. Buddying people up of someone who's kind of just on the other side of that in their early 20s with someone who's going through it can be really powerful. The younger person can learn from the older person. The older person can really understand what that girl's going through. She knows that managing periods when you're doing sport is a real kind of faff nightmare. Having period pain is really horrible. She can really empathize and share and help with that younger person. So thinking of ways we can use that like empathy skill within our teams, even creating little groups and having them work on things together, and just kind of trying to take advantage of the fact that this is how our brains might like to work, and really drawing on that ability to connect with one another, empathize with one another, and support one another. As a coach, I think one of the best things that I could hear, I'm not a coach, but I think if I was, one of the best things that I could hear was girls don't mind how many gold medals you have in your back pocket in order to be motivated and driven and gain confidence from you. So again, brilliant studies in psychology, one of them only on gold medalists. So there was one of my colleagues who I used to work with at the Sports Institute had done a study only using gold medalists. So a very niche kind of sample, but it was designed to try and really understand high performance. And it was to understand how those athletes were motivated and found confidence in relation to their coaching system of support. And what that research found was that the guys want a coach who is technically amazing and reputationally amazing. I want a really good quality coach. If you've won gold medals before, yeah, I'm going to believe that you can help me win a gold medal too. Versus the girls, the female athletes, who much more valued the quality of their relationship with the coach over and above the quality of that coach. So it didn't matter how many gold medals they had or how many, teams they'd led to league champions. What they really valued was the investment that coach put into their relationship. So understanding them as an individual, understanding what works for them and what doesn't in terms of hockey and performance and training, understanding their life off the pitch, being interested in them as more than just a hockey player, being interested in their life and caring about them. And the reason I love that kind of research is because that is completely within your control. Having won a few gold medals is unfortunately now out of your control as a coach. But investing in the relationship with your athletes is totally within your control. And finding ways to do that that's really meaningful will have a direct effect on that player's confidence to be successful. And that was that data came almost over and above any of the physical preparation they did, whether they'd been injured, whether they had great performances leading up to a competition or not great. This coaching relationship came out over and above. So it's really powerful, and it's really interesting that there is a difference between girls and women and boys and men. And I think it's really exciting because I think as a coach, you have so much potential to invest in that relationship with the girls that you coach, whether you're coaching at that high performance level or not. And then here's some other things. There's loads of things to do with how girls engage with sport and what impacts them when they're training and how you communicate with them, and things that we know from research that helps and things we know that don't help in terms of growth and development of an athlete. So girls are often driven by personal mastery. So again, research that's compared men and women in sport has shown that men are much more ego driven. So they will, if you want them to be competitive and you want them to train really hard, you will make them compete against each other. Try and beat that guy there. Try and beat the person who's, kind of chasing your position in this team, making them compete against each other. That's not as effective with girls, and actually making them compete against themselves, setting themselves personal bests that they can beat, and thinking about making progress is often much more effective. And actually inquiring and getting curious about how did you do that, getting them to think about the process, because actually girls really like getting curious and asking questions about why did that happen, how did we do that, what was that about, and so you can really lean into that. We've done some nice work where we've interviewed coaches who have coached both men and women, and one of the biggest contrasts they found is that girls and women like to ask lots of questions, and that's brilliant because essentially that leans into girls kind of wanting to understand the process. For coaches, that can be really annoying, especially if they're not used to it. So we interviewed a coach who worked in rugby, and he said, I used to be able to go into selection day and say, you're on the team sheet, you're on the team sheet. Unfortunately, you're not on the team sheet this weekend, da da da. And everyone would go, okay, boss. And everyone would go out to practice. So when I coached the girls, I was like, you're on the team sheet, you're on the team sheet. Unfortunately, you're not. The girls would be like, why? He's like, well, I have to discuss that. But and then why is Emma not on the team sheet? Like she's been and they'd want to know the whys, and there'd be all these questions, and then there'd be the emotional processing. And the coach was like, I would have to allow for, I used to have to allow like 15 minutes to do this job. I'd have to allow half a day. But he said, once I understood that, that was just how this team needed to process that. Once I learned it, it was so much easier, because then when they came out to practice, they weren't all looking at me like with daggers and thinking, I don't want to be here, don't like you. They'd had that chance to ask questions, to get curious, to process emotion, show emotion, and then come out and say, right, I'm ready for training. So it's really interesting, the contrast. Girls like to be encouraged. They like shout outs for improvement in their own performance, not necessarily like compared to anyone else. Girls really like to co-create. And again, I've worked with coaches who find it really hard to allow their players to co-create sessions with them. I work with a netball coach, and I said, one of the things that girls really like is being able to contribute to how the session runs, and really understand the process of how the session runs. And I said, one of the ways you could do that is just letting them design the warm-up. And she said, oh, Emma, I've tried that, and just goes terribly, because they do it wrong. And I was like, oh, how many times have they done it wrong? She's like, well, I only did it once, because they all exhausted themselves in the warm-up, and then they were no good for my technical bit of the session. So the next week I just took over the warm-up again. And I was like, what if we had just let them get it wrong a few times, and then like just kept asking questions about what was going wrong, and allowed them to co-create this warm-up that in the end really worked, and they could be really proud of it. And that would be really a really good example of how to allow the players to kind of get involved and feel a part of the coaching process. And no matter what level girls are competing at, there an element of fun, exploration, and adventure and enjoyment is always really, really important. And that sounds obvious, but actually, again, there is a sex difference, and boys tend to be able to say, oh, I'm not enjoying it at the moment, but I'm just kind of pursuing a goal, and I can see the goal. Even when girls are really grittily and determinedly and committedly pursuing a goal, there has to be some form of enjoyment, even if it's just like, I hate the training, but I love my teammates at the moment. There has to be some kind of enjoyment, and we mustn't forget that. Girls are held back by lack of authentic connection between the coaches. Not knowing names, not knowing kind of like who people are, what's going on in their life, can really, really affect that relationship, and therefore their motivation and confidence. One of the things I think is really interesting that comes out of research into girls and boys is about how things like forfeits and what we might have called humiliation kind of penalties in sport, when if someone dropped the ball or did a miss hit, everyone would have to get down and do 10 press ups, or that person would have to do shuttles. Those things can really affect the psyche of a female player. Girls tend to use that shame or humiliation that's kind of being used as a tool to make them remember not to make that mistake again, and turn it into this spiral of shame and really linger on it, and ruminate. And so actually the outcome is that you don't create someone who's motivated to do better next time. You create someone who feels ashamed, embarrassed, and disappointed with themselves, and that closes them down. So we have to think of different ways to make people remember not to make mistakes, but we can't. I don't think using forfeits and penalties and humiliation is working well with girls and women. Girls tend to have more perfectionist tendencies than boys. Perfectionism is where you attach your own personal value to an outcome. So I am what I achieve. So if I do well in this team, if I make it into the first team, if I impress the coach, they're going to like me, they're going to value me, and I'm going to feel my sense of worth. That isn't particularly healthy, because what it does is it stops girls wanting to fail. And when I say wanting to fail, like we all have to fail to learn. That's a really important part of growing and developing, isn't it? Making mistakes, thinking about them, reflecting on them, and then learning from them. If we have this perfectionism and this fear of judgment, we are often much more conservative. So to counteract that, we have to tell the girls it's okay to fail. We have to give them permission explicitly. I don't think they're going to believe it otherwise. We have to create psychological safety, which means we have to say, if you fail, it's okay. I'm here to help you think about what went wrong and how to learn from it. I will not judge you. I will not criticize you in a way that makes you feel like a failure. And there will not be consequences to every single little failure that you have, like sit on the bench or you're not playing at the weekend. I understand sport has to have some judgment, as in you're not good enough to be in the team or not. But in terms of those micro mistakes and micro failures, we need to create this sense where girls feel safe to do that and to learn and move on. There's this phrase of encouraging being brave over being perfect. There's a great TED talk of the same title and a great book actually of that title, which is all about gender differences and about how girls are taught to be polite and obliging and not to take risks as much as boys are when we're growing up. And that leads to how we approach life later on. And that can really hinder us wanting to be bold, do something that we don't know if it's going to work, because actually if it doesn't work, we know we're just going to learn and be able to go again. So thinking about that in your players or personally as a player, how you can try and let go of that outcome driven perfectionism. Like it doesn't matter if the outcome doesn't look perfect. What have we learned on the journey and how can we use that to do better? And that actually no one's perfect and it's okay to not get things right. And that leads into the next thing that we know about girls is that we're not very good at self-compassion, being kind to ourselves. In fact, I think most humans aren't actually that good. But some of the research that's been done in female athletes has been showing that if we teach girls how to be kinder to themselves, they actually have a much better mental health, self-belief, and attitude in their sporting life. So girls tend to be pretty harsh on themselves, and that links back to the perfectionism. So encouraging them to be kind to themselves. And if you look up self-compassion in female athletes, there's a really nice body of research if you're interested in it. And it gives some strategies and that you might want to share with your teams, which are talk to yourself as you would do a friend. You never hear, the girls are really supportive of each other. You'll say, look, I know that today the match didn't go so well, but you've been working really hard. You're a really good player, like believe in yourself, and you're really supportive of that person, but you don't talk to yourself like that. And actually perhaps we could do with doing that. Encouraging someone when they're having a hard time to notice that other people have experienced similar things. It's called common humanity. It's like we all go through this stuff, and just validating it is really helpful. Journaling, whether it's writing to yourself with kindness or journaling about the event really objectively, taking the emotion out of it, are also other strategies that girls can use. But we know that teaching self-compassion is really, really effective in helping with girls' mental health and with their self-belief in the sporting context. And that goes to that whole idea of being brave, not perfect. And I would really encourage you, the TED Talk is about 10 minutes. So have a look at that. It's a really nice TED Talk. The final thing I wanted to touch on when we think about mindset is a bit it goes slightly at a right angle to the psychology piece and the mindset and the coach relationship, but it equally is such an important part of how we think and behave as female athletes, and that is how we think and behave about our body and our attitudes towards food, our bodies, and all that goes with that. So again, the research suggests that so many girls feel pressure from their coach, excuse the spelling there, about their body weight and shape. Even if that coach hasn't explicitly said, I don't think you're the right shape, I think you're carrying too much weight, whatever, to be in this position or to be successful. It's just a feeling of pressure. And I started off, with a story about Bobby Clay and how actually the idea was that runners need to be light and lean. And that was just implied, didn't even need to be explicit. In some sporting contexts, it really is said out loud a lot of times, and that's really damaging. But I think we just need to be really aware of how girls' brains work when it comes to bodies and shapes and sizes. Because how girls think about food is very different from how boys think about food. Girls will cut out whole food groups far more than boys. Girls will restrict what they eat far more than boys. Girls will go on fad diets far more than boys. And girls will be much less likely to celebrate food as fuel and energy as boys. So when we're thinking about how do I get the best out of my players, how do I make sure they're energized for their game, how do I make sure that they're recovering really well so that they adapt and progress, and food is a really important part of that, it's really important to think about the fact that it's not just about telling them, because you can tell someone what the right thing to eat would be. You can tell someone, go and have some milk and peanut butter on toast after training, because that's just a really great protein carbohydrate combo for refueling and helping you recover really well. You can tell them that. You can tell them that they need to have breakfast every day, because it's actually really damaging to the quality of your training and to your physiology to not eat when you wake up, particularly if you're sporty. You can tell them that information. But what's happening in their brain is all of this like subconscious societal influence, which says everyone thinks that girls should be small and lean. This is the ideal beauty standard. This is what you could look like if you don't eat very much. Oh, look, this is what someone else ate in a day, and it wasn't very much, but they're still amazing. And this is just a constant narrative. All the people I see on a movie screen are a certain shape and size. All the people I see in adverts are a certain shape and size. My mum's always on a diet. From every direction, girls get this narrative about food and about body size and shape that actually goes completely against what we want them to believe in sport, which is use food as your superpower. Like, it is an amazing fuel, and it is a critical part of your sport. So as a coach, if a player was missing training week in, week out, the conversation you'd likely be having is, look, I get it. If you don't want to come to training, don't come to training. But I do know that you really want to progress in this sport and you want to make this team, or you want to, make this position. So you're going to have to show up to training. It's like a non-negotiable. So I get that that would be an obvious conversation to have in sport. If you had a player who you knew wasn't eating breakfast and wasn't fueling particularly well, would we be comfortable having the same conversation? Which is, I know you've got real ambitions to make this team or be in this position. And if you don't eat properly, like, it's not going to happen. It's a non-negotiable that we work together as a team and address how you can get your fueling right. And I know it's really hard. And I know there are things going on that make it harder, but I'm going to work with you, or I'm going to signpost you to someone, or I'm here for you if you need me to help us get that bit right. Because if you don't get that bit right, performance is not going to come. I don't think we have those conversations, partly because they feel really sensitive, but I think we need to start getting more positive and proactive about girls' attitudes towards food, particularly in the context of sport. And the other thing that can affect mindset, or can be affected by mindset, is kit. So how a girl looks and feels in her kit can really affect how she feels and performs. And kit is like laced with this sort of like deeply entrenched tradition of why we wear things. But actually kit can put girls off from even playing. And kit can be a real anxiety inducing thing. So if you've got white kit, if you've got white bottoms, for example, white shorts or white skirts, when you're having your period, it can induce anxiety by having to wear white. If you've got body hugging kit and you're someone who isn't body confident, you can feel really anxious about wearing that type of kit. You might not feel comfortable wearing a skirt. Hockey there's a brilliant kind of initiative going on by Tess Howard down in the England squad. And she started the Inclusive Kit Charter, which is, does kit work for everyone? Does kit make people feel good? And for the first time in Paris, the GB squad were allowed to choose whether they wore skirts or shorts. And half of them wore skirts and half of them wore shorts. And that's the first time a team has worn kind of half and half at the games. And that's just kind of saying, what do you feel most comfortable and what do you feel able to perform at your best in? So that's asking about how people feel and then accommodating that and feeling kind of like you can, and not that you're stuck in this idea that, well, that's what we've always worn. So that's something about how kit feels. And then finally, that last set of bullet points kind of go back to the bodies and fueling and eating. There is a very definite narrative now that if we are working with athletes, we do not need to focus on assessing body composition. Traditionally in sport, we would have always done that. We would have weighed, we would have done caliper assessment. I remember as a sports scientist doing body composition, caliper testing on so many different athletes at all different levels of sport. It is advised now that we don't focus on body composition unless because we're really worried about growth and development or health, that someone is unhealthy from an obesity perspective or an underweight perspective. Anyone in between those two ends of the spectrum, it's advised that we do other metrics of performance that mean that we can say someone is fit enough, is fast enough, is strong enough, is agile enough, is flexible enough, is recovering from injury well enough. All of those other metrics that mean we don't have to focus on what someone's body composition is like, because we know that those kind of assessments have a detrimental effect up here. They lead to disordered eating, they lead to dysfunctional relationships with food, and they can lead to eating disorders. So actually, we can just get rid of that risk and say we're going to use other metrics to assess performance, and we're not going to focus on how much fat, muscle, and water is in someone's body, when actually I can say whether you're a good hockey player or not by these other metrics. So those were just other things I wanted to mention in terms of how our brains are working as females, which we might be able to influence by our behaviours and actions in the sporting context. Okay, so I managed to get to the end on time, which is just unlike me, but I have 2 minutes over, so nearly. I'm gonna open up my chat box to see if anyone's asking any questions. Feel free to stay or go for those questions. I wanted to point you in this direction of our online course. If it's something that you wanted to know more about, we've got some online learning that's specifically designed for those working with women in sport. And we've also got a book out, so if it's something you want to know more about across all of the topics that I talked about at the beginning, then please go and have a look at our book. It's now available in paperback as well, so it's slightly cheaper. And please do get in touch or follow us, because we're kind of on a mission to make sure everyone gets the information they need to support women well in sport and to be a woman who feels like they really belong in their sport. Okay, so I'm just going to open the chat. Oh, thank you for everyone who's saying thank you. People having to jump off to go to hockey, which is understandable. Okay, I'm going to keep my chat open for a minute in case anyone's got any burning questions. I'm going to be back for other webinars. We're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. We're going to talk about puberty and what girls go through during puberty. And there are some other ones as well. So if any questions crop up along the way, just feel free to ask. I tend to throw lots of information out on these ones, which is hard online because I can't see you or can't see whether you've dozed off or not, but hopefully some of it resonated and you maybe get you thinking about how you can use some of that information in your in coaching. And it's being recorded. So if you want to go back, or I'm assuming if you want to share, then please do. But otherwise, thank you for all your messages, and I really look forward to seeing you again for our next session. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.